Okay, so welcome to this GLAS, Global Language Based Area Studies event on the French presidential elections, challenging perspectives on the French presidential elections. We've got three excellent speakers here, whom I will introduce just before their talks, but for now I'll just say we've got Professor Alastair Cole, Dr Nicholas Startin and Dr Emilie Tran, and we are going to be taking questions via either the chat box, or I think we can allow you to speak. We have to unmute you. We will also be recording this, so you'll get a little fly thing that comes up that you will need to swat away, saying that you are happy for it to be recorded. I think I will introduce Alastair now. At the end of this session, there will be an opportunity for you to give feedback. On 6th to 7th of June, there will be an additional event, which is the Global Language-Based Area Studies Doctoral Training Conference, involving all of the DTPs from the UK that deal with area studies. And that's going to be a very big event, and I highly recommend attending that as well, and perhaps Nicholas, you might be at that as well. Just introducing Alastair. Alastair is known to many of us as he was in the politics department and also in the European Studies department. He is now head of Department of Government and International Studies at Hong Kong Baptist University. He co-created a research group here in Cardiff known as EGIP. He has been a major player in the ESRC, has just published an ESRC project in the form of a book entitled Trust, Transparency and Multilateral Governance, and has also written extensively about Macron, about France, and about just about anything you could ever want to read about. And without further ado, I will pass you on to Alastair, who is going to talk about the French presidential elections en attendant Macron.
Thanks, Gordon. It's great to be back in Cardiff, even virtually. You know, it's great to be there, and I'm sure we can exchange a bit later on. I'm going to essentially say a few things about Macron, and I'm going to say a few things about the election, and then look to the future. I think, in a way, to sort of sum up to start with, we could say clearly French presidential elections are key contests in France's democratic game. I guess this presidential election we've just seen was a bit flat for much of the period. You know, it appeared, at least until the first round, to be somewhere else, frankly. Things were going on, but they weren't necessarily going on in a standard, routine style presidential election, for obvious reasons, pandemic, and of course the war in Ukraine. Now, in this context, Macron was criticized for declaring himself to be a candidate very late on, in early March, and then only making a couple of controversial policy commitments in relation to raising the retirement age to 65 or changing the conditions of attribution for the minimum income. Now, in a sense, it was felt that the first round, at least, was fairly flat. Was there a campaign at all? This question was asked. Certainly, between the two rounds, the campaign came fully to life. Macron, actually, I thought was very good. He reconnected with his popular touch. Marine Le Pen performed rather better, perhaps, in the debate than she did the previous time, but Macron was clearly elected victor. So, in that sense, that's sort of setting the scene. That's the what happened bit. No, it's not so much the why bit, but three dimensions of this what happened. So I'd like to go back and look at Macron's political leadership, then identify under a slightly provocative title, what's wrong with Macron? And Emilie will recognize that because that was a talk we gave at Hong Kong University last week. And then finally, some challenges looking ahead. So to say something about Macron, I guess, in a sense, trying to frame Macron in a more generic thinking about political leadership. What is it? How should we conceptualize it? And I think it's always useful to try and think of political leadership in terms of being a 2 or a 3 level game. Okay, so it's clearly it's an individual enterprise. Macron has his own individual skill, his persona, if you like. It's also a strategic institutional enterprise. Macron is French president, and of course, it's going beyond the narrow context of France, and in Macron's case, at least, trying to transform European opportunities into domestic opportunities, to put it very briefly, internationally as well. So I'm only going to focus on the first of these. I'll just say something about Macron, but I think we have to bear in mind that leadership is an interactive process, and the extent to which an individual can weigh domestically can depend in some circumstances on what's going on elsewhere. But more often the case, if a leader is weak domestically, then it plays out on her capacity to make a difference at the European and international levels. So let's go on to Macron. Can we say that Macron's been a success? Well, certainly, yeah. I mean, in terms of being a political entrepreneur whose fortunes lay in the rejection of the existing party system back in 2017, then we have to say that Macron's been a success. He was a success in breaking up the old party system, exercised tremendous skill in a way in redefining politics in terms of being a central game, a political centre, but also a centre of gravity, creating Macron en marche, if you like, as occupying that centre of gravity, flanked by two extremes that would appear to be not unelectable. I must be very careful what we say in French politics these days, but clearly not occupying that strategic advantage of being in the centre. And of course, we only have to look at the performance of the Gaullists candidate and the Socialist candidate in the 2022 presidential elections to realise that strategy, just purely politically, was a successful one. Macron's also been obviously a very reformist president during the early period of his office, the first 12 years or so. First 12 years, not yet, first 12 months. Here you can see the time difference between Hong Kong and Cardiff, first 12 months or so. But we do see clearly that most of the Macron period was overtaken in a way by crisis. By social crisis with the yellow vests, by health crisis with COVID-19, by international crisis. And in a sense, Macron, I think, managed these crises reasonably well, although we can discuss this. But it's clear that the mode of crisis management was one of not exactly facilitating open and transparent democratic discussion between different parts of French society. So that's my favourable interpretation. If we were to make a rather less favourable interpretation of Macron, we might go along with anthropologists who talk about political tricksters. Now, a trickster is an individual who, albeit unintentionally in Macron's case, somehow subvert the systems that carry them to power. And when we see with Macron, I think it's very interesting because on the one hand, Macron appeared in 2017 as a very good fit to be president. Of course, he went to he gave his acceptance speech in the Louvre or whatever. And so he appeared to be a very good fit, but then almost immediately, by adopting a really quite divisive political language, maybe a deliberately divisive political style, he appeared to some extent to undermine the basis of the, if you like, the national unity cloak that the office of the presidency gives an individual. And I think it's one of the more curious things about Macron is to try and understand this Janus type personality, combining rather contradictory modes of behavior and belief systems. And we could talk a lot more about that. But I think in a sense, this has not done much to diminish the sense of crisis of trust in French politics, which has clearly been aggravated maybe in some senses by the attempt to redefine political competition in terms of progressives against nationalists rather than left against right. We can come back and talk about this. I think part of the problem with the Macron enterprise is it's very, very effective in a not a destructive, but in a rejection sense. It's effective at unpicking the main party families, but rather more difficult in defining a core political project. Number two, the second point, what's wrong with Macron? Well, not much really. I mean, he was re-elected. Let's not forget this. He was re-elected with 58.5% of the vote. There's been a very unfortunate sort of campaign in a way to say that Macron's been poorly elected, but has he really? You know, he's got 58.5% of the vote. Okay, the abstention rate was up. He got more votes than Francois Hollande in 2012. He got a higher proportion of the registered electors than Pompidou in 1969. We could go on with lots of other examples. I think the idea that Macron's been poorly elected, it's a political maneuver, particularly by Mélenchon on the left, to try and play out the third round, which we can, of course, maybe come back to. But it is true, of course, that 2012, it does reveal disturbing trends in French democracy. The consolidation of the far right, the rise in abstentions, the collapse of traditional centre-right and centre-left pivots, strong performance of anti-system parties, and so on. These are all, objectively speaking, factors that create tensions for the French polity. And I think in a sense, just my final point about this before looking at challenges, we might think of Macron in terms of being post-politics in a way. It's clear that part of the Macron enterprise, it is post-politics. It's based on the ebbing away of left and right. It's based on attempting to create a new sort of cleavage, progressives against nationalists, if you like. The destruction of the old is obvious. The strategy of triangulation, attracting erstwhile opponents to the camp, is quite an effective one, but it's not clear what has replaced this or what can replace it. The ni-ni strategy, or in positive terms, en même temps, it produces a sort of hesitation and a shifting between apparently contradictory positions. And I think Macron became even a little bit opportunistic during the period running up to the campaign. I'm not going to talk about the yellow vests because my esteemed colleague Emilie Tran might say a word on that. I don't know. Challenges to the future. There's lots of challenges. Let me just mention four very briefly, so as not to speak too long. The first one, clearly, I suppose the process itself of, in a way, finishing the electoral series. The electoral series, of course, it's not 2 elections, it's 4 really. And clearly a president will not have embedded his or her legitimacy until that process is finished. Now, we'll see what happens. We had a discussion in our seminar at Hong Kong University last week. 2 members of the panel thought there would be a cohabitation and 3 members of the panel didn't. I was in the no cohabitation part of the group, and for reasons we can clearly explain. Even if Mélenchon appears most certainly to have sparked an acceleration of the union, the old union of the left, or the Nouvelle Union Populaire Écologiste et Sociale, I'm not so sure this will be enough to allow the left alternative to win, particularly in the context of a legislative election following a presidential one. We'll see. It might happen. It's not totally impossible. But even if it doesn't happen, we've got to see, who's actually supporting Macron? Well, you'll say to me, En Marche. Of course, that's true. And Macron's getting incredibly involved in the inner dealings of En Marche, validating the candidates and so on. But there's also, to my account, at least 9 other parties that are trying to maneuver themselves into a presidential coalition. There's Horizon, Agir, Modem, the Radical Party, Territoire de Progrès, Fédération Progressiste, En Commun, Refondation Républicaine, and there's probably a couple of others that I've forgotten about, actually. And in a sense, it's quite classic in a way. It's classic of situations where there's a weak presidential party, a bit like the UDF, actually. The UDF had 6 parties with Giscard, but there were other personalities coming in and out. And so ultimately, of course, the UDF did not survive. But then ultimately in France, not many parties have survived for an extremely long time. Whether the Socialist Party survives the current move to create a new version of the Union of the Left is, of course, an open matter. Let's move on then. So there's many other questions, but I think the real question behind this is what's going to be the capacity for reform? Assuming there's a new prime minister, there will be. Assuming there's a majority, there will be for someone. Is it going to be easy to reform French politics and society? Of course. Michel Rocard, in the last time he was prime minister, 1988, wasn't it? Basically, you can rely on Article 49, Clause 3. You can have a minority government. A president can survive. but we'll just have to see really what will happen. So I think that's a major challenge. And of course, Macron, unless he changes the constitution, he's been re-elected now. Does he become a lame duck president, as the American presidents are typically described? Well, probably not, but there are certainly some people around Macron who would quite like to facilitate that process. And I think his former Prime Minister, Edouard Philippe, might be one of those. Second major challenge, of course, it's the language of the third social round. The streets, going the strikes. We already saw on the 1st of May, what might happen in this rather tense social situation. Clearly, the economic prospects across Europe and across the world are not particularly rosy at the moment. The revival of the left, we'd have to see how that plays out. I won't overinterpret that. But clearly, there will be challenges of governing capacity. There's going to be economic challenges ahead. I won't go on too much about this. But in a sense, what's interesting with Macron is coming in a way, in a slightly Mendesist view about the need for rigor and to manage the economy and reform, and yet finishing with a quoi qu'il en coûte, whatever it takes, opening up the spending machine, giving checks to people for whatever, 100 euros for energy and so on. And I think in a sense, there is a real problem here. There's a real problem, I think, in controlling public expenditure, controlling expectations, and clearly, as was obviously the case during the election campaign, the big issue was, of course, living standards, and of course, people have suffered, and of course, there are deep inequalities in society. There's another set of challenges, European and international ones, which we could certainly talk about, but I don't want to spend too much of my time speaking on this, except to say that the Janus nature of Macron, I feel, certainly the way that Macron is quite successful in some respects in using positioning in the European or the international level to trickle down to favour him domestically. That can work in both senses, of course. It can work in both senses. And if in a way Macron is seen not to be able to control the French economy, for example, over the next years, then will this have the effect of weakening, I suppose, France's prestige? We don't know, but it's clearly, it's a two-way mechanism, this, and it's a very important one. So back to domestic politics. In my blog, I've just published 2 blogs, actually. I shouldn't, shameless self-promotion, but one is in the Loop, which is the ECPR blog, and the other one was in the LSE blog. So please read them. They were both published yesterday. I'll send them to Gordon. But basically what I say there is, to finish up with, is that the president has earned a second term in office. He is yet to ensure his presidential legacy. Thank you. That was my conclusion.
Right. Yes, thank you, Alastair. Sorry, you concluded quicker than I could actually manipulate the various buttons down at the bottom of the screen. So thanks for that. That really was wide-ranging and fascinating. And we all know that you have been steeped in these issues for a few years now, actually, and you're a world-renowned expert. So thank you for that. Emilie, I'm going to just introduce you very briefly here. You're talking about the political weight of the French living abroad, and you are an assistant professor and director of European studies at Hong Kong Baptist University, doing research on China's relations with Europe, the Middle East and North Africa. I notice you're also working on Twitter and health diplomacy, which is interesting. And I also know that you are an elected official, conseillère des Français de l'étranger, representing the French abroad. And you've had various distinctions, including Chevalier de l'Ordre de Palme, and I would like to know how you managed to get that, because I'd love to get one of those myself. So I'm over to you, and I'll let you give your presentation.
Thank you very much, Gordon, for the nice introduction. Good afternoon, everyone joining from Europe. Gordon, to address your first question, I can just write a letter to say how wonderful a scholar you are to the l'ordre des palmes académiques, and then you should get one. So we can discuss after the seminar. So for my part, and I feel very humbled to speak after our great specialist of French politics with Alastair Cole. So I will just limit myself to share a few comments on how the French voted, especially in territories or constituencies that may not be that discussed by the French media or maybe by people outside France. So if I share with you my a few short slides in order to give you a better idea of what I'm going to talk about. So when I say talking about constituencies and territories outside of metropolitan France, and really this is what I'm trying to do here, because outside of metropolitan France, we have two types of constituencies. First of all, we have the overseas France, and those territories, departments, regions, collectivities are indeed part of the French Republic, and they do represent quite a number of people voting, close to 2 million people. So when we talk about, of course, you all know that I was not sure whether we would have students joining the seminar, so I put up that map for those students, but of course we all know that France has departments, regions, and overseas collectivities spread from the Indian Ocean to the Atlantic and Pacific Ocean. And when we look at how they voted, it is quite interesting to see this map that you have under your eyes. So in the Atlantic Ocean, if we start with the left-hand side, we have these few territories, and you can see across those three maps, basically only in the South Pacific did the French people vote for Macron and En Marche. In all other what we call overseas departments and regions, people voted in the second round for Marine Le Pen. And that is very, very surprising, knowing the legacy of slavery of those territories. And one would wonder, why would these French people with their historical legacy would vote for Marine Le Pen? While in 2002, you know, Le Pen father would not even go into the second round in these constituencies. So there are many explanations for that, indeed. One of the explanations is that certainly those territories for many decades have felt very far away from Paris, very far away from metropolitan France, and they don't feel like they are treated on an equal basis or as a French citizen, or they believe they are treated like second-class citizens. The COVID-19 and the way the COVID-19 had been managed in those territories has not helped. And there are, of course, those very contextual crises such as the COVID-19, but there are more lingering, impactful, long-term also crises that we can mention. So all these territories, they all voted for Mrs. Le Pen in the second round, but for various reasons. So all of them have various difficulties, reasons, and during crisis. So for example, the territories in the Indian Ocean, such as Mae'r or Guyana in Southern America, they are left with their borders issues for many years, immigrations, heavy immigration, and over the years, the French Republic and Paris was never able to find a proper solution. You had the COVID-19, of course, as I mentioned, but in other territories such as in Guadeloupe and Martinique, you have plantations of bananas, and they were people used a particular pesticide, chlorothalonil, that was very harmful to the land and polluted basically the land and the water for the many generations to come. And again, Paris was not able to find a proper solution to this. So you see, across territories, they all have their specific issues, but all of them are faced with socio-economic problems, difficulties. They feel far away their purchasing power, because Marine Le Pen has made her entire campaign from the very start last fall 2021 on purchasing power. And if you go, as Alastair is going to do this coming summer, into those overseas territories, you will see that on the shelves in supermarkets, prices are much higher than on metropolitan France, because a lot of those goods are shipped from France, from metropolitan France. So people have the salaries that they have in metropolitan France, but their purchasing power is much less because of this socio-economic structure between the metropole and the overseas territory. So that explains, so all these explain why people voted mainly against Macron, and many of them, of course, voted also for Zemmour and Mélenchon. And in the second round, we can see that a lot of them, indeed, a majority of them, except those territories in the South Pacific, voted for Le Pen. So really, this is to say the huge divide between Paris, between metropolitan France and its far away overseas territories. We talk about this divide, of course, in all our French politics discussions and scholarly research about this divide between the urban areas and the periphery, but this is really embodying the periphery as we know it. So now another constituency that I would like to shed light on is really this French living abroad. France is one of those countries or states that we characterize as diaspora state. China, for example, is another diaspora state. Israel is another diaspora state. Russia or Turkey are also diaspora states. But France has these particularities among diaspora states to be a democratic regime that gives its overseas nationals the voting rights. So voting rights of the French overseas are quite important, because this is basically representing 3% of the people voting in the entire France. So we can see that the candidates were very much trying to get votes from the French living abroad. So when we talk about the French living abroad, you can see on this map here, and this is why I had to use the slides, the world is divided according to the French system or worldview into 11 constituencies. And you can see that these 11 constituencies are broadly divided across the continent, and we have one large constituency where we belong, Alastair and I today, because we live in Hong Kong, that goes from Eastern Europe down to Oceania. So this is the 11th constituency where I am the representative of the French overseas in Hong Kong and Macau. So when we look at how the French overseas voted, not surprisingly, you can see that the French overseas have voted for the candidate who represent their global outlook and values, pro-European values most, and this is Emmanuel Macron. But also, very surprisingly, in the first round, Jean-Luc Mélenchon, who wants an independent France, who is quite skeptical towards the EU, who has some dubious attitude towards Russia and also towards China. Mélenchon came second, and then we have Éric Zemmour, Yannick Jadot, and Marine Le Pen. So you see that Marine Le Pen is really not favored among the French living overseas. So amongst the people represented the left-right divide, we have certainly the French overseas, because they have been overseas, they are entrepreneurs, many of them. So they are liberal minded. For them, Emmanuel Macron represents the best candidate. And then if you are more leaning towards the left, then you would go for Mélenchon. And you would see that there is indeed a big gap between the first candidate and then the other ones. So second one, Mélenchon, and then Zemmour. And then, of course, in the second round, the French overseas who voted for Mélenchon, most of them cast their vote for Emmanuel Macron, and those who voted for Zemmour casted their vote for Le Pen. But here, the difference is still quite large, because among the French living overseas, you have 86% voting for Macron and Le Pen gathering only 13%. So when we look at these figures, there is something that is important to mention, is the abstention. And the abstention, as you can see here, is indeed very high. You're close to 60%. So there are several reasons for that. One very concrete, practical reason is that those constituencies, as you can see on those maps, they are quite large. Not everyone lives next to an embassy or to a consulate in order to vote. For the presidential elections, people could only vote by going to the voting station. Or to do proxy voting. And that was not very convenient, especially in times of COVID, where in certain areas, traveling was very much restricted, such as in Hong Kong today. So you have constraints, physical constraints due to the territory, but you also have more enduring again trends. French living abroad, because they have been living abroad for many years, they go back to France only during holiday times for short periods of time. So they are less interested in French politics. And when we have followed the no campaign, because Alastair argued that there was maybe no campaign, so there was no campaign, but at the same time, the content of the campaign, the topics of the campaign were very much centered, focused on domestic politics in France, so of very little interest towards of the French living overseas. Quite interestingly, Jean-Luc Mélenchon was the only candidate who advocated a universal tax, even for the French living overseas. But despite this, in his program, he was very popular amongst the French living abroad. So I think that's all. I'm happy to answer any questions that the audience may have in the Q&A session. Thank you.
Right, thank you, Emilie. That was a great talk, and you gave me time to click on my little video button, so thank you for that. And our third, and by no means last but not least, speaker, Dr. Nicholas Startin, former head of the Politics, Languages and International Studies at Bath University, or University of Bath. Former chair of UACES, which is a very important European studies organization, now a senior fellow at the Global Governance Institute in Brussels, and about to be taking on a new role in John Cabot University in Rome, and talking about a vision for Europe, or a vision for France, the EU as an issue in the 2022 French presidential elections. Thank you so much for agreeing to give this talk, and the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Gordon, and thanks very much for inviting me to this talk. And it's a pleasure to be on the same panel with Alastair and Emilie. While we're still all kind of digesting what's been going on in the French elections, and with the legislative elections to follow, there's lots of us to kind of speculate and think about. Well, look, I'm going to break my talk, which is obviously around the role of the European question, into three parts. Firstly, I'm going to look at the importance of Europe, or the EU, as an issue for the electorate in the actual campaign. Secondly, I'd like to have a little drill down into the attitudes and the approaches towards the European Union of the major candidates in terms of their kind of policy and rhetoric. And then finally, I'll conclude with some thoughts about where does this all leave us in terms of France's role in the European Union as we move forward in the second Macron presidency. So let's begin with the importance of Europe, or the EU, as an issue for voters. Now, analysing the centrality of Europe as an issue during the campaign is actually quite a challenge. On the one hand, it appears to be very central to the campaign, and on the other hand, it seems to be quite on the margins of the campaign. Much of the political science literature on Europe as an issue in domestic politics traditionally states that, you know, the EU is not a major issue. It's not something that features as one of the major motivators for voters. Yet, if we look at the commentators, for many of them, the second round choice in the election is between a Macron and Le Pen, one of whom is a globalist, the other is a patriot. You could even push the boat and say it's a competition between a nationalist and a pro-European. So it's interesting that Europe as an issue, or opposition to Europe, is a central dynamic in the campaign. But if we look on the surface, it doesn't really appear to be the same in the opinion polls. So if we just take not a poll at random, I wouldn't do that, but if we take a particular poll, an IFOP poll, which was conducted in the week before the first round, La construction européenne, or European construction, European integration, is mentioned by only 9% of voters as a motivating factor in their choice of vote. They were given two options that they could choose. This was the second last amongst a choice of 12 issues, so it came 11th out of 12. You know, pouvoir d'achat, the cost of living, was 61%, santé publique, public health, 38%, and the lutte contre la délinquance, the struggle against delinquency, was 33%. So Europe is way down the list, although admittedly 23% of Macron supporters mentioned la construction européenne, which is significantly more than the single figures of all the other major candidates. So although it features as an issue more for Macron voters, it would seem to bear out what the traditional literature says about Europe as an electoral issue with regard to the first round vote. But I think we need to be a bit cautious, because I don't think this paints the full picture. Because if you think about it for a moment and think about Le Pen voters or Zemmour voters, they're not going to answer a question which talks about Europe in such positive terms, la construction européenne. I mean, if it had been labelled opposition to the EU, I'm sure it would have featured much more prominently amongst those voters who were looking to vote for Le Pen or potentially Zemmour. Because in the same poll, what we see is that, you know, 26% of voters talk about identité française as a reason for their voting choice. And in a way, that's almost the flip side of being pro-European. And this figure was as high as 48% amongst Le Pen voters and 78%, according to this poll, among Zemmour voters. So, in a way, identité nationale is as much of an indicator, I think, of opposition to the EU as answering the question, la construction européenne. You know, I think what we have to bear in mind is the polls don't really account for the measurement of Euroscepticism. They talk about Europe very generally, or they talk about European integration, but they don't put any kind of negative spin on the language that they use in the actual poll. So if we look at a poll between the first and the second rounds, I'm looking at a BVA poll here, Europe, the word Europe, which was used, they were allowed to choose as many issues as they liked, Europe being one of them, features 20th out of 21st, or out of 21 issues that were in this particular poll. Admittedly, 35% said Europe was a factor, but they were allowed to choose as many responses as they wanted, and it ranked second last amongst 21. And I think another point to mention, though, is that often many of the issues that are mentioned in the surveys have a European dynamic to them. They are a kind of also a European or a EU question as much as they are a national question. When we think about war in Ukraine, when we think about the one I've mentioned, national identity, when we think about immigration and the Schengen issue, for instance. So to conclude for section 1, what I'm really saying, without giving you anything concrete or empirical, is that the importance of the EU and Europe as an issue for voters is not as straightforward as it appears on the tin. It's not quite like it seems in terms of the polling data, when often it's pitched in a kind of terms of European integration rather than perhaps opposition to the EU. So that what we do know, despite those low rankings of Europe directly as a motivating force for voters, it was clearly a major backdrop in the election for the candidates. And this backdrop and importance of Europe was further intensified, as Alastair, I think, alluded to in his talk, by events, the COVID pandemic and the war in Ukraine. So even if the electors don't seem interested in the European question on the surface of it as measured by the polling, the candidates certainly were, which brings me to the second part of my talk, which was to take a quick look at the major candidates in the election and their pitch on Europe. We'll start with the president and his European vision. I mean, without stating the obvious, Macron's vision for France and Europe are inseparable. This is a president who strode out to celebrate his victory in 2017 with the EU anthem, Beethoven's Ode to Joy playing. I can't imagine that happening with a UK Prime Minister, maybe in Wales, but certainly not in England. So for Macron, France still holds the presidency of the EU Council until the end of June. And Europe has been, front and centre for the president in the build-up to the campaign, to which he came too late, and during the campaign. Macron's pitch in the election was that he really wants to renforcer l'Europe en assurance en autonomie énergétique, technologique et stratégique, to reinforce Europe and to assure its autonomy in terms of energy, technology, and strategy. But he also wants to reform Schengen and to what he calls reinforce nos frontières, our frontiers. And he's not always clear whether he's talking about French frontiers there or European frontiers. But one thing's for sure, he is straying there a little bit into the Le Pen territory when he starts to talk about reform of Schengen. So Macron favours a geopolitical Europe, closely aligned to Ursula von der Leyen, close to key players like the Italian Prime Minister, the Greek Prime Minister. I think what he wants in this geopolitical Europe is things like higher military spending for the EU nation states, a common debt to fund its programs, as in the case of COVID. He wants to see the role of the euro become more enhanced. But there are some problems for Macron ahead, I think. His communication with Putin has caused a little bit of unrest, I think, in some states, in the CE countries. He appears to be, on the surface, have a sort of anti-American, anti-UK vibe going on as well, a little bit in the Gaullian tradition. And I think his relationship with UK is a little bit problematic post-Brexit, particularly as we're looking at a stronger NATO, the regeneration of NATO. And obviously the war in Ukraine, I think, is a potential obstacle for him in terms of his vision for Europe. But France's role in Europe is crucial to Macron. It's somewhat similar, and I'll be interested to think what the other panelists think about this, but it's somewhat similar to Sarkozy a decade ago, who saw the EU as a potential protector and an enabler, a positive driving force, if you like, in terms of managing France's relationship with globalization, both as a kind of economic and cultural entity. This, I think, is in direct contrast to his second round rival Marine Le Pen, who very much sees the EU as a stepping stone to all the kind of the bad points of globalization. In the past, I've mentioned that the FN, or now the RN as they are, has increasingly used opposition to the EU as a strategic and tactical lever to help them move beyond their traditional kind of anti-immigrant single issue labelling. And such a strategy, my argument runs, or ran, helped such parties to widen their electoral base, to put it very crudely, as espousing Eurosceptic sentiment is much less contentious than the traditional anti-migrant territory. And all this was kind of assisting the process of, the detoxification, sanitization, what the French call dédiabolisation. However, since Florian Philippot left the party in 2017 after the previous presidential election, what we have seen is that the party has reined back from this hard Eurosceptic discourse. Whereas in 2017, Marine Le Pen was talking about her intention to come out of the European Union, Euro, have a referendum on one or the other. That softened between the two rounds in 2017, and 5 years on, although she remains hostile to the EU, she's talking about an alliance of a Europe of nations which will progressively replace the EU in the midterm to overcome the kind of anti-federalist ideological approach of the EU. But it is a major switch from exiting the Eurozone, and it is a dilution on the surface of the hard Eurosceptic position that Marine Le Pen previously adopted. I think because the FN and the RN now in their polling data could see that coming out of the Eurozone was losing them voters, particularly amongst the older generation. So I would argue that opposition to the EU for Marine Le Pen in this election, it still remains something of a tactical lever, built on the knowledge that actually the RN couldn't push any further on hard Euroscepticism. So Marine Le Pen is no longer playing the call me Madame Frexit role that she played after Brexit. The mood music has changed. It's no longer about exiting the EU or exiting Eurozone. It's about reforming from within and cozying up with like-minded countries and leaders like Hungary. So that's, I think, a noticeable change from the RN and Marine Le Pen in terms of the European discourse, which has kind of left the road open a little bit for Eric Zemmour, who talks also about wanting to reorient the European integration or European construction towards a Europe of nations. But for him, he talks much more about le contrôle de nos frontières, the control of our frontiers and political migration and the supremacy of national law. So if anything, it's, although he's not talking about coming out of the EU, it's Zemmour that's kind of moving more into the kind of what Taggart would call the hard Eurosceptic territory. I think for the Republicans, there is trouble ahead, because for Valérie Pécresse, the Republican candidate on Europe, I think one of the reasons why her score was so low was that actually, if you look at her position on things like Europe, it was so close to Macron's. Talking about a patriotic Europe, yes, but talking about autonomy and defense, talking about a renegotiation of Schengen, it looked very similar to the Macron package. And I think the problem for the Republicans now, post the election, not just their electoral problems, but they've got to have a discussion about the European question again. Because Pécresse's vision of the EU is very different to the deputy leader, Eric Ciotti, whose stance on the EU is more aligned to the RN position, or even Zemmour's Reconquête. So my PhD, gosh, 20 odd years ago, was about the Eurosceptic wounds that haunted the Gaullist Party back in the day of Charles Pasqua, back in that kind of 1999 new millennium era. And I think, this whole European question is part of the discussion that will need to take place as the Republicans try to repackage themselves for both these legislative elections and moving forward for the future. For the radical left, Jean-Luc Mélenchon, very much wanting to rip up the existing European treaties, going back to that sort of slightly kind of radical left view that, Europe being this capitalist club, and trying to, really push on a more idea of a social Europe, but not coming out of the euro and not wanting to exit the EU. And I think it's going to be interesting to see what will happen with his party Insoumise electoral pact with the Greens, Mae'r, for the parliamentary elections. They've agreed that France should stay in the EU and the Euro, but in their statement, they've said that they're ready to disobey the rules on the European Union. And I think for Mélenchon, it's something that's always ticking over in his mind. I think one of the reasons he left the Socialists in 2008 was because he felt that the Parti Socialiste was too enthusiastic about the EU. So it's going to be interesting to see how the dynamics play out for the radical left in coalition with the Greens, in an electoral pact for the Greens over the next few weeks before the June elections, in terms of where they go on the European question. So that was point 2, really. It was just having a very brief overview of some of the candidates and where they stood on the European issue, which brings me to my final points, which is the conclusion. Where does all this leave us in terms of France's role in the EU? Well, certainly Macron now looks like the leading player on the European stage. And in many ways, there's a real opportunity for him to try and push on this idea of strategic autonomy for the European Union and how that will help France. The Schengen issue isn't going away. The Schengen issue has been on the agenda for a long time now, and it's been creeping up as we've almost seen this kind of mainstreaming of the radical right to some extent. And it'll be interesting to see how that maps out. That's a difficult issue to take on board and to please centre ground voters and also keep on board voters who may not be his supporters. The legislative elections will be interesting, I think. They'll tell us a lot more. The Rassemblement National remains cautious on Europe about its approach. It's still looking for that elusive winning formula that Kitschelt talked about many years ago. And, for every voter gained, you lose a voter as you try and go beyond the plafond de verre, the glass ceiling. And Europe's a tricky issue for Le Pen. How do we pitch ourselves? Where do we position ourselves? Do we go all out hard Eurosceptic? Do we become, come in a little bit and become a lot softer with our Eurosceptic rhetoric? And then obviously the Insoumise Vert Green Alliance is an interesting one, and Europe may feature as a slightly problematic for them. So just to sum up, the European dynamic, whether you phrase it as Europe, European construction, opposition to the EU, Euroscepticism, however you phrase it, it remains a very important backdrop in French politics, both in terms of election campaigns and in terms of policy. The war in Ukraine has made things more uncertain to predict. One thing's for sure, while Macron remains president, he will look to advance France's role within the EU, and next month's parliamentary election will be a really important marker for him in terms of how far he will be able to push his Euro enthusiasm. I'll stop there if that's okay, Gordon.
Thank you very much indeed, Nicholas. That was fascinating, a tour de force. I think we hear you. We heard everything you said, but when you lean back, we hear you less well. So just to let you know that, Nicholas, when you're answering questions. Now, as always, we don't always get people writing down their questions, and sometimes people are more willing to speak their question out loud. Whilst people are thinking, and also, whilst people are thinking, I'll read out some of the comments that have been made. One by Charlotte saying, it was incredible to think that in the late 80s, Jean-Marie Le Pen not even able to land in Martinique when protesters took over the airport. The plane had to turn about turn, and Emilie has responded, indeed, thanks Charlotte for sharing this incident. And then in 2022 in Martinique, 60.87% voted for Le Pen, so that's interesting. The main cause of other, and Emilie's offered a comment to you actually, Nicholas, about Valérie Pécresse's low score being her lack of charisma and ability to speak in public. I've heard that actually said as well, which made
Absolutely.
the Europe issue.
Can I pick up on that one?
Yes, please do. Yeah.
I agree 100% with what Emilie says around the actual election result. I agree with that. But what I think is important for the Gaullists moving forward is we know that this question of European integration has a history of dividing the party. And as they're looking a little bit kind of battle scarred after the election, Europe is a kind of issue that will rear its ugly head, I think, for the Gaullist movement as they try to kind of redefine where they're going moving forward. Maybe not even in this particular election, but as they try and reposition themselves over the next couple of years. You can see that European question still causes tension within the party. You've only got to look at the leader and the deputy leader to see how far apart they are on the question of European integration. But I agree with you about the issue. Yes, that's not a major reason why she didn't score well in the election.
Thanks for that, Nicholas. I see that Samia has left a question just before leaving for Alastair, saying, I strongly believe that Macron was poorly elected as people like me had to vote against Le Pen and not for Macron, and this for the second time. His score of 58% does not reflect a victory or people's support to his programme. Looking forward to the legislative elections. Any comment on that, Alastair?
Of course, I have a comment. Yeah, I mean, I think in a sense, this one is probably impossible to answer because people who believe that Macron has been poorly elected will point out to the 42%, according to post-electoral surveys, will say, well, 42% of people who voted for Macron actually voted either to be a barrage to Marine Le Pen, or effectively not on a positive basis for Macron's program. But I think you could probably say, the bipolar structure, and I don't contest that. I mean, the position that you were in, I mean, essentially many other people were in, many people voted, of course, for Macron because they didn't want the alternative. And that was one of the problems of this election, and it's linked, and it's to some extent a law of diminishing returns. And when I was talking about Macron as being in a sense, more as artificially to some degree, bolstering a progressives versus patriots sort of cleavage, there is, of course, an instrumental sort of dimension to that. And of course, that is dangerous in a way for democracy, because if in a sense, if people feel they have to vote for Macron, for example, to prevent Marine Le Pen, then naturally, that's not a satisfactory choice for many people. So I actually agree with the sort of sense of your question. Nonetheless, I think I would say that the particularity in the second round of the French presidential election is that that you eliminate on the second round. It might well be that you're eliminating Marine Le Pen, but if not, you would be eliminating someone else. I agree, Marine Le Pen is situated on beyond the pale for to be considered for most people on that second round. But I do think it's a bit dangerous to talk about being poorly elected, because what does that actually mean, being poorly elected? He was certainly better elected than either Le Pen or Mélenchon came third. Let's not forget that in this election. He didn't come second. He didn't get through to the second round of the ballot. And so I think in a way, it's a bit disingenuous as well, because it's saying actually that the result of that election that no one is contesting was a democratic election. The result of that election is to some extent illegitimate. I think that's actually quite dangerous for a democratic situation. However, I wouldn't expect everybody to agree with my comment.
Thanks, Alastair. I see that Nick Parsons had given the capacity to speak. I'm hoping that you are able to speak, Nick, and welcome to the party.
Thank you, and thank you, Gordon, and the panelists. I know it's very good to see you again. My question really is about looking forward to the future, and it ties in both with, I think, what Alastair just said about the legitimacy of the elections, and some stuff that Nick Startin was saying about the capacity to push forward an agenda. And I just wonder whether any insights can be gleaned for the legislative elections from electoral maps from the first round of voting in the presidential elections. Obviously, what you need is areas of strength rather than sort of an even spread of votes across the country to get people elected to Parliament. And there's been a lot of press coverage of Le Pen's score in first and second ballots of the election, but that sort of score in the past has been very difficult to translate into parliamentary seats for Front National and now Rassemblement National. So I just wonder if there are any thoughts about what the likely composition is going to be. I know Alastair spoke a bit about this, but looking at the fact that you've got a spread of candidates. Okay, Macron didn't dominate the first round, but got a fairly good score. And looking at the spread of votes, are we going to be looking at some kind of hung parliament? And what would then the implications of that be, or even minority government?
I think I'll have a quick stab and then let everyone else in, obviously.
Yeah, so basically I said it's about, what is the national spread of votes? Are there pockets of local strength that would give us some intimation of what Parliament is going to look like?
Thanks, Nick. Good to see you, even though I can't see you, but I mean, I can see your hand. That's the main thing. I guess my answer might be a little bit, I think your question is a very, very good question. And it explains really why parties like the FN have had such difficulty in getting a proper territorial representation in the past. And I think I would say, firstly, what are the rules of the legislative election? The rules are that it's effectively a plurality system on the second round because more than two candidates can go through. But in practice, in order to get through to the second round of the election, you have to have 12.5% of registered electors, which means on a turnout of 50%, you have to have 25% of the votes. Well, another way of looking at this is, if you take the three main families, if you like, Macron, the Union of the Left and the National Front, what will the constituencies be where 25% of the vote, on assuming a 50% turnout, will be garnered, if you like, by those parties? And I suspect that's probably more important than the geographical concentration question. But the geographical concentration question, actually, it might well, and I don't think we can just transfer presidential to legislative, but it might well be the case that clearly in that sort of electoral system, the party with the most votes basically will have a magnified representation in the national parliament. And I suspect that at the end of the day, that's going to favour Macron. I think it will favour Macron's, the presidential majority, which is a mechanism that there's no inevitability to it, and most certainly it could produce a minority government. But I would be surprised, especially given the difficult relations on the left, even though the Union of the Left agreement today, with the socialists agreeing, it's going to be extremely difficult for many people to transfer to France Insoumise ou inversement. So, and I think, in the old days of the early Union of the Left between the PS and the PC, the problem was that many PS voters would not vote for the PC. And I think in a way, what will happen now, it won't be exactly the same, because of course, La France Insoumise now will be at the center of that sort of left coalition. But I think, I know I'm not answering your question, Nick, but I think in a way what I'm saying to you is that it will be Macron because it's widely diffused. And I suspect that Le Pen the Front National will get more seats than the last time, but my bet would be only a handful more. I think the left will probably do much better because they've got a larger number of outgoing deputies, but I don't think they're going to be anywhere near coming to a majority.
Thanks, Alastair.
Emilie, do you want to say something? You've already written in the chat box. Do you want to just...
Yes. Yeah. Thank you. I was putting in the chat box latest opinion polls results according to various scenarios, and it seems that two different opinion polls are giving a kind of almost equal score seats, with a majority still for La République En Marche, but a majority that would be less comfortable than what it is now. So as Alastair said, I also believe that National Assembly would be presidential party dominated, but not by too far. And some opinion polls say that RN will come second, followed by a third group of deputies from La France Insoumise. But then, as we are speaking now, the left-wing parties are still negotiating, so we might have an alliance of all the left parties, and they might collect altogether 28% against 24% for La REM. So that's another opinion poll. I won't say that's quite possible, though. What I would say is that La REM will continue to dominate, but not that far, followed by a coalition of the left and then the RN, Rassemblement National.
Excellent. Nicholas?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it's going to be a fascinating parliamentary election, and I think my two colleagues have made some very pertinent observations there. I mean, normally we're expecting Macron's party to win a majority. That's the normal scenario of a parliamentary election that follows a relatively convincing presidential election. But it does look a little bit less certain this time to make that prediction. I would say that there is a good chance that Macron's party will have a majority, but I'm certainly not certain of it. And that then leaves us really with the radical right and radical left agendas. And what we can see is that the radical left are already better at strategizing and forming potential coalitions and pacts. And it remains to be seen how broad that left-wing coalition becomes. But if it does broaden out, we could see the left doing rather well, I think, in the parliamentary elections. On the other side of the coin, I'm afraid, as often happens with radical right parties, there seems to be an element of fragmentation and not a real desire to form an electoral pact that would increase their opportunities. I mean, that might develop, but at the moment, that looks a difficult scenario. And I think as well for Marine Le Pen, we know historically that the RN or the FN, as they were, the presidential election seems to be where they perform better. They find it difficult to turn that into seats. And there are a number of reasons for that, I think. And Alastair's already alluded to it. I think the idea that we could get 3 candidates through in the second round, and then we can be in, one candidate dropping out. And we've got a Republican front. Quite ironic that a party that is called the Rassemblement National still finds itself in a position where it may have a Republican front opposition in the second round of the parliamentary elections. So that's, I think, one problem. And the other problem is, this failure to be able to really do any coalition building with the other parties on the radical right and pro-sovereignty parties. So where does that leave us? Well, I wouldn't want to make predictions, but I could see the RN actually not doing as well as either the radical left or Macron's centrist party. So I don't know, but I think it's going to be a difficult election for the Rassemblement National to turn that into seats. And we've also got the Gaullists, in the background. I know they're not polling very highly, but they do know how to run a good campaign. They do have their pockets where they're strong. Probably going to get more than 8% of the seats if they get their strategies sorted. So yeah, it's a difficult one to predict. Will there be a majority? Oh gosh, I don't know, Alastair. Will there be a majority for Macron?
There will be the means to govern. The president always wants the means to govern, but of course, a government can govern without a majority. Of course, it can govern for 5 years using Article 49, Clause 3, but. Were that to be the case, then that's going to be a really, really difficult issue for the whole overarching questions of trust in the democratic system. And I think that this is a real danger because, we can think back to 1988. And of course, Mitterrand was re-elected. Everybody thought the socialists would get a huge majority, and they didn't. There was a minority, if you remember. Minority government with Michel Rocard, who managed to sort of plod on for 3 years because he was repeatedly using Article 49, Clause 3, which in theory he wouldn't be able to do now because he can only use it once a year. So it makes it a bit more difficult. But you could imagine a scenario. I mean, frankly, the executive is extremely strong in French politics, so it's not impossible to imagine a scenario that even as long as there's not clearly a majority against a government named by President Macron, then you could well see an LRM, a pro-presidential government, even without necessarily a majority. Although I do think, however, just to put my fingers to the mast, or whatever the metaphor is, I do think there will be a majority for the République en Marche and allies.
Okay, thank you very much. People are leaving because it's the end of the hour, but if anybody has a question, just please feel free to ask as well. And Nick, you can actually put your, Rule has asked the question. Rule has said, Nicholas mentioned French identity. Does he think this is mostly a political slogan, or does it point to a more important shift alongside the rise of the Rassemblement National? Is it mostly a political slogan?
Yeah, no, I think, this election, identity politics, however you want to define it, whether it's around immigration or sentiment towards Islam, or the way the RN has kind of pitched the laïcité, the secular model, to their advantage. I think we would have to acknowledge that this issue of identity has been more, whatever we mean by that, more at the campaigns. And I think it is part, without wishing to sort of necessarily say that I fully support this notion of the mainstreaming of the extreme right, but I think we are seeing an element of that this territory is now becoming more mainstreamed and much more comfortable territory for a debate and a discussion, and that what we might traditionally call mainstream candidates are debating around those issues in a much more comfortable way than they would have been 10, 20 years ago. So yeah, I think, and it's not just in France, is it? I think this is a European and global phenomenon, and we've seen it as well. We've seen identity become a major factor in other countries like the US. It does seem to be where democracy is heading, and this kind of idea of illiberal democracy, that famous phrase, identity, is a core part of that kind of rhetoric.
I'd like to concur with Nicholas here, and I'd like to also add that talking about French identity is no longer the chasse gardée, is no longer the prerogative of the RN or far right. Every party, including La REM, have spoken of French identity using different components. Mélenchon, when he's advocating for rapprochement with Russia and with China, he's also advocating for types of a French identity that is to be independent on the global stage. When Macron is advocating pro-Europe policies, he's also advocating one type of French identity. So we are seeing a lot of French identities being personified by different types of candidates. And today, French talking about identity is no longer just constrained to the far right type of discourse.
Alastair, you're going to add something, or shall I? Maybe.
No, I was just going to say that I think the quality of my colleagues in Hong Kong Baptist University is very high.
It's outstanding. They are Chevalier de l'Ordre. So basically, I was just going to ask about one was the voting of people in some of those overseas territories for Le Pen and so on. I mean, I'm guessing that is partly because they have not looked at the manifesto as well. I mean, or do you think, is it just purely a protest vote? But a lot of people said, has anybody actually read some of the things that are in her, what she's promising to do and so on? So I wondered about that. I also wondered about this idea of a political trickster where have you got that from, and how would that work? And also, how much agency does a president have within, the French system as well? Is there enough space for trickstery or trickery? And then I suppose, Nicholas, in particular, I'm just wondering where this Franco-German tandem is going now that there are issues with the German Chancellor and so on, and where we stand on Macron's idea of a European army, which I know he is quite attached to. And I think Ukraine has probably dealt a blow to that now that NATO is no longer brain dead. So, I mean, I suppose my question to you, Emilie, probably wasn't very clear, but I just wonder, where that vote has come from,
Yes, I hear you, Gordon. That's a very good question. And my answer to you is, how many people do we know around us who actually read the programs, the manifestos? Very few. Today, people just look at TikTok videos, very short formats of videos, and that are repeating in your own bubble of social media communication. So I think what Marine Le Pen said, it's about purchasing power, and the rest, it may be written in her program, but it was very much toned down in all her public speeches. And if you have read the program, you could know the references, but if you didn't read the program, she looked quite acceptable to you. So it was, as sociologists, political sociologists have analyzed, a strong protest vote in the overseas territories. Really to say that for the past 5 years, Macron was all about words. He did actually visit the overseas territories several times, but he never delivered. And that's really a protest vote. But at the same time, these people are very much for Republican values. They just felt left aside, and this is what is happening with the peripheral vote in metropolitan France.
That's very good. Thank you.
I'll come in on the trickster. I mean, in a way, it's to liven up and spruce up the seminar. But basically, I think the key point here is that I suppose the dominant interpretation of Macron, if we take leadership as I was trying to sort of present it, as saying that, if we are interested in agency, and that sort of anticipates your question there. I mean, I think French presidents, their agency is limited, but I don't think you can assume they've got no agency. I think, particularly a French president makes choices, exercises skill, arbitrates, and so on. So I think you have to just assume that an individual leader has some agency. But once you say that, what interests me, it's not so much, does Macron's not a Viktor Orban, whatever, who goes out to, if you like, subvert democracy. That's not Macron, no way. But is there a sort of unintended consequence of the sort of political message that Emmanuel Macron has been using to get to the top spot, if you like, which is actually to deconstruct an existing sort of party system? Why not? I'm not saying it's sufficient, but it is based on a sort of deconstruction of a party system. And actually, paradoxically, it's based a little bit also on deconstructing the existing office of the presidency, because the presidency being an extremely powerful office, and in a way, Macron appearing to fit very well some dimensions of that, but actually undermining, I think, in a way, undermining the some of the more, in a sense, powerful. I'm getting a bit tired, but some of the more powerful dimensions of the office, actually undermining it through the types of political strategy, if you like, that have been used through his 5 years in office. Not just the anti-partisan bit, which does have a little bit of populism about it, to be honest, but also the slightly aggressive public discourse used in the streets. There were reasons for this. It's disruptive management and so on, but it doesn't, the goodness of fit, if you like, with that office of the presidency rests to be demonstrated. So it's in that sense that I think we should not exclude the idea that there's a bit of tricksterism in Macronism in that. Yeah. And of course, when anthropologists talk about political tricksters, they basically mean that it's someone who comes to an office in order to sort of subvert it or change it. I'm not saying that's purposely what Macron's doing, but it might just be the consequence of some of his action. And that might actually feed back into the discussion we were having before about whether he'd been well or poorly elected, which is, of course, an entirely legitimate discussion.
Thank you. Excellent answer. Thank you.
Could I just pick up on Alastair's point there about deconstructing the party system? You know, I mean, that in a way is an achievement of Macron. You know, he's managed to see off the centre left as represented by the Socialist Party and the centre right as represented by the Republicans. But you know, moving forward, the whole notion of this kind of en marche centrism is so constructed around Macron that you do wonder what happens to that party in a post-Macron era. You know, will it retain its parliamentary strength, or has this kind of push to the centre really only resulted in fragmenting to the radical right and the radical left? It'll be interesting to see what happens in the post-Macron era, which I know is a few years ahead, and what the longevity of En Marche will actually be. But that might be, you know, for another discussion. But to come back to your question that you asked me directly, Gordon, about the Franco-German relationship. Yeah, there's no doubt that it's been a little bit rocky in this during the period of the war in Ukraine. They've not always had a joint message and joint signalling. That said, you know, this remains, I think, the Franco-German relationship. You know, that much used phrase, the motor of Europe. I do still think that both countries will really want to limit any differences that they have moving forward over the next 5 years. And I think that, you know, the Franco-German relationship will remain strong. But it's interesting, isn't it, that Macron seems to be edging a little bit closer to Italy, certainly while Mario Draghi is the prime minister there. You know, and they're fast-tracking this kind of Lyon-Turin high-speed rail link. There seems to be, I'm not suggesting that Italy is going to replace Germany, but he's obviously looking to extend his reach to immediate neighbours. And we've also seen that with Ireland, haven't we? As the French relationship with the UK has deteriorated post-Brexit, in particular around the terrible situation, the humanitarian crisis across the Channel, we've seen Macron, you know, really courting Ireland as another close ally. So I think the dynamics of where Macron will look to position France and look to his kind of European allies are changing. But Germany, I still think, will remain the central component, the central country that France will continue to look to and to seek to have agreement with on as many things as possible as we move forward over the next 5 years of the Macron presidency. But obviously, I think, you know, he's now in a post-Merkel era, looking like his influence stretches, because he is, you know, probably the most, would he be the most famous current European elected politician? Probably.
So thank you very much. We've got 5 minutes left. Nick, by the way, you can actually turn your camera on if you're not in your pajamas, because I've given you the capacity to do so. Rule has asked the question. I'm guessing the panel will not know the answer to this, so I'm warning the panel in advance, which is, to what extent has the demise of Opération Barkhane, the Barkhane mission to the Sahel, been a part of the election debates?
Zero part.
Yes, I was thinking that was the answer as well.
There was very, very little foreign policy debates, and the only foreign policy discussion was about the war in Ukraine. No talks about anything else, including China, relationship with the United States, nothing. So very much domestic politics in this campaign, and that's why the overseas French, the French living abroad, more exactly. They were not really interested in that campaign. I'd like to go back to a comment made by Nicholas about what France would look like after Macron. And I would tend to believe, so we are being recorded and we can play back again to see whether I was right or wrong. I would tend to believe that indeed after Macron, there won't be any more La République en Marche. When we look at the people surrounding Macron, they are not very experienced nor charismatic politicians. And the few tenors, the few very charismatic people he has around him come from LR. But when we look at what the people around Mélenchon, when we look at the people around the Jadot and other parties from the left, I am more confident that there is the next generation who can replace the leaders. So let's see, unless Macron is able to groom, l'AREM is able to groom some people to take over in the next 5 years, but I don't see them now. I haven't seen them in the past 5 years, actually.
I think that's a really good point. Just to come in on that, I think probably both the socialists and the Republicans are in a difficult place actually at the moment. But I see that the problems for the Socialist Party, given the dynamism on the left, could be greater perhaps than the problems that the Republicans face in a post-Macron era. I could see a resurgence of the Republicans. They've been dealing with a lot, haven't they? Lots of leaders that have had corruption hanging over them, financial corruption. They've had a list of presidential candidates that didn't look too great on the ticket in the end. And then the latest candidate, Precas, as you pointed out, not having a particularly dynamic campaign at all. So I would say it's too early to write off the Republicans as a party, and you could see them making a comeback, I would say, over the next decade.
Can I just come in here briefly? I think 2 points. One is, throughout the Fifth Republic, there's always been this mechanism of the presidential party, the presidential movement, or la majorité présidentielle. It's always been it's sort of a bit amorphous. It might take the form of a strong party, but it's more likely not to. It's more likely to take the form of a set of interests that coalesce sometimes into a party, sometimes beyond it, that provides support at a particular time for the president, but then once that individual is no longer there, actually just wither away. I mean, the UDF is quite a good example of this. The UDF was created by Giscard. Its function was to support Giscard. It never really became a presidential party. And I think actually La République en Marche is the classic presidential party in that sense. Its function, what are its belief systems? Well, we have a bit of difficulty, but its function clearly is to support Macron. Now, clearly there are many diversities within, and people are coming from different backgrounds, but that's been its principal function. I would say about the Socialists and the Republicans that I don't want to write them off either, because I think both of those parties, not because I'm a nostalgia for the PS, although I did write my thesis on the PS, and it was, it'd be a pity to see my object of research disappear. However, I think more seriously than that, let's just think back. What were we saying after the départemental, particularly the regional elections? The Socialists held on to 5 regions, the Republicans got 7. I mean, in a way, it's not so much that I'm going to trot out again my two different party systems, but there is an element of that. The real parties, if you like, are still embedded in local and regional government. Now, those parties, of course, they're going to transform themselves in some way, and there will be realignments. But those are going to remain strong points in the French political landscape. There's no doubt about that. So I think it's too early to write. I mean, maybe the Parti Socialiste will no longer exist, and the name might change. But I think it's going to be difficult to actually write off that legacy of a strong, because France is a system of weak parties, but it's a system of weak parties that is compensated by strongholds in local and now regional government. And I think that's so I think there's a future for those parties, at least at that level.
Excellent. Nick, did you want to come back on anything? Nick Parsons, did you want to come back if you're still there on anything that was said?
Yeah, a fascinating discussion. One of the things that struck me about last presidential elections in 2017 was the legislators that followed were characterised by an extremely high rate of abstention. In the second round, it was over 60%. And I just wonder how long French democracy can continue limping along in this fashion, having really high, because the legislators, it seems to me, have become, I won't call them second order elections, but they are perceived as an appendix to the presidential elections increasingly, I think. So I just wonder how long, the French democratic system can carry on limping like this when you have such high rates of abstention. So I suspect the same will happen again this time round. The big issue, who's going to be the president, has been dealt with, and this has become a second order issue.
Can I come in there again? Just very briefly. I've just made I've just written a blog, which I don't do very often because, it's tedious. But and what struck me looking at this election actually is, if we think about this election, trying to think of historical sort of comparators, I'm forced to go back to 1951, because 1951 we had the Communist Party on the left, and the Communist Party had one of its well over 20% of the election, about 21%. We had the RPF on the right. Of course, the Gaullists did well in that election. And then we had the Mae'r, and the Mae'r was the sort of collection of centre-right, centre-left parties, all pushed together in defence of the Republic. So defending the Republic, defined a bit negatively, defending the Republic. Of course, that was 1951. 1958, there was a different political regime. The political regime of the French Fourth Republic had staggered on. It did ultimately. There was a brief respite, I suppose, in 1956 when Guy Mollet won the head of the Republican Front elections, but that didn't last for long. There was Algeria and so on. So I think, in a way, I'm not predicting that the Fifth Republic, particularly because we're being recorded, I'm not predicting that it's got 7 years left. But I think there are some mechanisms and some interesting historical parallels. And I wonder also whether that reform to the reform to introduce the 5-year term and to harmonise the presidential and the parliamentary elections, I mean, it is having some damaging consequences, and Nick, you pointed them out quite rightly. And it also links up with your previous question, because it means that how many of those people are actually going to be able to get more than the 12.5% of registered electors on the first round if there's a turnout of 50%? It's not going to be that many, actually. So I think that's a big challenge ahead for the French democracy.
Thanks, Alastair.
I was just going to add there, actually, the Rassemblement National, given its kind of share of the vote in the presidential elections and its likely lack of seats or very few seats in the legislatives, it does make me think of UKIP. And UKIP in Britain became a problem as there's a disconnect between parliamentary representation and the share of the vote that it was garnering as well. And the consequences of trying to cope with UKIP outside of the parliamentary system were not good, We got Brexit and so on. So that is a worry that I've got. I'm not sure how many people were voting for Le Pen, but I was in France recently, and I did speak to people who said about Le Pen, oh, she's too pedestrian now. We need une vision transcendantale des différentes, and I was thinking, okay, so Marine is not, she's not extreme enough. She's talking about purchasing power and so on. But I do wonder, are these people all just going to go away? And, if they don't have any voice other than at the local level, the Rassemblement National supporters, because some of them really do believe,
Mm.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't draw too many parallels with UKIP. I think, UKIP to me were essentially a single issue party that was looking to get the United Kingdom's exit from the European Union. Whereas I think the Rassemblement National is a much more permanent feature of the French political landscape. And it is, you know, a party that has been around for a long time, although it has struggled to get representation in the Assemblée Nationale. But, you know, I mentioned it before, the plafond de verre. It's you know, the Rassemblement National may have gone as far as it can go. If you are a challenger party from the radical right and you're looking to be a party of government, it's a really difficult act. Every step you take, it's like treading on eggshells. You know, we're going to change our policy on this, and we think we're going to appeal to this demographic. But if we do that, we may lose existing voters. And I know you could say the same about all parties, but it really is that sort of delicate balancing act to try to get a majority of voters. And I'm not convinced that the RM will be able to build significantly on what they've achieved in the 2022 elections. It remains to be seen. But I think they'll be around for a long time. They'll be around as a party that does is the main challenger party at presidential elections, a party that doesn't do particularly well in the National Assembly, and a party that has mixed regional success in municipal and regional elections. But, you know, I think, I don't think we should necessarily be too pessimistic about, you know, what lies next. And to go back to what Alastair said, you know, this is a president who has won a second term, won with 55% plus, and you know, what else could Macron have done other than fight the election campaign and win? And he's done that, and let's see what happens in the parliamentary elections. And is the Fifth Republic in danger? I don't know, but I suspect it's got more longevity than we might fear.
Thank you for that. Does anybody have any very last points to make? Because we're over on time. So any attendees might want to leave, and the speakers will probably want to get to their bed in some cases fairly soon. I'm looking at you, Alastair, actually, in particular. James or Alastair, did either of you want to ask a question before this is your chance, before we wrap up? If not, I'll...
Can I just thank the chair, Gordon, for the expert, the stewardship and timekeeping.
My goodness.
Thanks to Cardiff for having this, you know, in transnational sort of event.
Well, I mean, I'm really glad, I mean, that we've been able to get together and do this. We've had a decent crowd here. It's dwindled away now towards the end, but we've had a decent number of people, most of whom I know have an interest in the French department. We didn't get the message out fully to politics and international relations, but I know there will be your colleagues as well who would have come on board as well if this were not week 11, which is the last week of teaching. But I really would like to thank Alastair, Emilie and Nicholas and all the attendees as well for what's been a fascinating debate. I mean, I've learnt an enormous amount. Anecdotally, I voted for the first time in the French presidential elections because I've now got nationality. But what I did notice, and I spoke to other French voters, was that not so long ago, it was quite difficult to vote in French presidential elections. Everybody queued up at the consulate. But now there are several sites all over London for voting, you know, making it a lot easier. And I had in the back of my mind what Emilie's abstract, which said that most French overseas voters vote for Macron. And I thought, well, maybe he's facilitated our vote, because I literally, my vote was done in 9 minutes. I was in and out in 9 minutes, which was really quite remarkable. And I only really did it so that I could hear them say, "A voté," you know. And if I hadn't voted, they could only have said, "Aurait voté," and I wouldn't have been happy with that, you know. So it was a nice experience.